Good afternoon, everybody, or morning, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Jason Cooper. I'm a civil engineering consultant with Kimley Horn and Associates, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This is part one of a four-part series that Kimley Horn is going to be hosting regarding solar series webinars. This one is behind the scenes of solar developments, where we'll be focusing on just that, the development cycle of the solar process. I'm going to start with just a couple of housekeeping items for the folks that are in attendance. So everybody that is joining this Zoom meeting live is an attendee. You will not have access to mute or unmute your lines. You will not have access to turn on or off your video, but you will have access to the question and answers function of the Zoom meeting. So we're going to try to save some time at the end for Q&A. So as questions arise throughout the conversation that we're having, feel free to drop any questions you have into the questions and answers tool, and then one of my colleagues will be filtering through those behind the scenes and sending those my way. That way, if we've got time at the end, we can answer some of those questions. If we do run long, we're going to be respectful of everybody's time, so we'll be wrapping this up right at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. If we aren't able to get to any questions and answers, we'll be providing all of the panelists and my own contact information when we send out a copy of the recording. That way, if you do have any follow-up questions or you want to reach out to any of us, we're more than happy to chat. So without further ado, I will kick it to our panelists to do some introductions here, and I'm going to weave the first question of the webinar into this introduction. So Michael, we will start with you. First question is why go solar? Personally, how did you get involved with the solar industry? And then tell us a little bit about Invenergy and your guys' background in addition to your intro.
Got to unmute myself. First, thanks for the introduction, Jason and Kimley Horn, for putting together this presentation for those that are able to join us here today. Jason mentioned, my name is Michael Kaplan. I'm the Vice President of Renewable Development for Invenergy. In undergrad, I studied political science and sociology. Subsequently, got my MBA. And started working for a land development firm, primarily residential and commercial development, before getting synced up with Invenergy and starting my career here in 2010. And found there was quite a bit of similarities between the land development work for residential and commercial properties and that is required for generation facilities. So why go solar? From an Invenergy perspective, so we're an owner operator of natural gas, battery, wind, and solar facilities, and we're operating across the country and around the world. So for us, and we're an independent power producer, so we're trying to serve the needs of various utility or commercial and industrial buyers of power. So for us, the penetration into the solar market has been a natural evolution for our company. There's a lot of the same competencies that are required for some of those other forms of generation. And most notably, there's been an increase in demand from our customers for solar energy, particularly the drop in cost and the coincidental time of day pricing that solar generation provides relative to some other forms of generation. So from our perspective, solar is just one component of a generation mix that has got costs and benefits, and that's kind of how and why Invenergy got itself involved.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Michael. Appreciate that. Ethan, same question to you. Quick intro on yourself, and then how did you personally get involved with solar, and what's Nexamp's history and background?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Echo Michael, and thank you, Kimley Horn, for this venue. Thanks all the participants for joining today. My name is Ethan Giles. I'm Director of Channel Development at Nexamp. Channel Development is our team that focuses on project acquisitions from other development partners around the country that we then integrate into Nexamp for construction and long-term operations and maintenance. My own background, studied environmental science in my undergrad years, and then civil environmental engineering in grad school. Worked for 8 or so years as an environmental consultant, project manager, engineer, focusing on a variety of different environmental type projects, mostly in the realm of contaminated site remediation, working with clients to clean up their legacy messes, essentially, industrial manufacturing, chemical sites. Through that work, kind of got familiar a little bit with the growing world of solar 5-6 years ago. Worked with a couple of solar clients at that time. Decided that would be an exciting thing to get into. Started looking for opportunities in renewable energy generally, and saw that at the time Nexamp was a much smaller company 4 years ago. Was looking for a project developer that also had some engineering background. So it looked like a good way to get my foot in the door. Took that opportunity and have been with Nexamp for the past 4 years. So Nexamp started out about 12 years ago as a company that was kind of focused on helping other people go renewable, whether it was solar, small scale wind, some thermal stuff, mostly residential, small commercial. Kind of focused exclusively on solar in subsequent years, and since then has really been on a growth trajectory in the community solar space specifically. So we've worked now, starting out in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, broadening into the wider Northeast, and have now been working in community solar friendly states as those policies are enacted around the country, including Illinois, New York, Maryland. So we keep tabs on those states and try to get into those markets. We've been doing a little exploring lately of standalone storage and utility scale storage, but our real bread and butter and our competitive advantage is in the community scale solar space. So happy to get more into that as we go forward here in the conversation.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ethan. And then last but not least, John, if you want to go through a quick intro, and then as a consulting engineer that supports solar developers like Nexamp and Invenergy, both on the community DG side and the utility side, if you don't mind giving a brief history to Kimley Horn and our role in that process, I think it would be good.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. So I'm John Barefoot, Kimley Horn, licensed professional engineer here in North Carolina and work out of Raleigh. I'm a NC State engineering grad. Got about 11 years experience in the land development arena. I joined Kimley Horn in 2015 and just worked on a wide variety of projects, kind of commercial, industrial, retail, but solar related work has really been a passion of mine since joining KHA. And I think I've been doing an ever increasing amount of that since joining. It's probably 80 to 90% of my focus right now, and serve as a regional leader here in the Southeast for our solar team. And I help developers like these two and EPCs as well on many solar sites across the Southeast and really sprinkled throughout the country. I love it when all projects run smooth, but I do enjoy the strategy and the challenges that come from solar development and what it can throw at you. And so I think thinking about Kimley Horn and our role in this space, I mean, we started dabbling in solar probably around a decade ago. A couple scrappy practice builders really won some jobs and wanted to learn more and more. And it was really a side hustle. But as these projects continue to just pencil better and solar related design work just grew, we made more connections. And so we kind of started out on the EPC side, but quickly made relationships with developers and began to add value there. In general, we're a multidisciplinary engineering firm, so we do aviation, transit, all kinds of asset classes. We have 4,300 employees, about 95 offices across the country. And in the solar space, we are ranked number 2 in solar design by ENR 2019. And I think we're always innovating and just trying to understand how to generate better information earlier to help with de-risking. And we definitely have a one-stop shop approach and trying to figure out a way to offer every service that's needed from kind of A to Z on these projects. I think my job as a consulting engineer on these, at the core, we're providing hydrology, environmental, civil design and landscape and expert witness testimony, anything you need, wide variety of technical stuff to navigate entitlements. But I think we go far beyond that here. We really see ourselves as a part of the development team. And in order to do that, I really think we try to understand all the dynamics of the developer and their methodology, how they de-risk, schedule milestones, what are the underlying goals behind why they're asking us to do what they need. And I think consolidating that info really lets us look around the corner. And we like to identify challenges before they ever arise. And we've just gained a deep bench of knowledge that we can bring to the table, and that helps with strategy. And then I think we love sharing knowledge with developers as well. We do a lot of brown bags for their development teams, engineering staff, and we also have that foresight into the EPC world. So that really helps us understand what entitlement commitments might mean when they really hit the ground later. And so it's all about thinking about the bigger picture and thinking outside the box, and sometimes having difficult conversations when the logic is on our side, and sometimes we're navigating process that aren't really geared with solar in mind.
Yeah, great. I echo that. The collaboration, I think, is one of the coolest parts of the solar industry, is just all the different people you get to work with, and the developers and the EPCs and new markets. And we'll go through some of that here today. So thank you all for those intros and your personal backgrounds and company backgrounds. With that, I'll kick off the first question here. Ethan, I'm going to direct this to you, and it's kind of a three-part question, so feel free to tackle it as you see fit. But when you guys are educating local communities, how do you navigate those areas that have little to no solar understanding? And how do you build trust with the local public and then public officials? And then how do you approach those markets differently that are already familiar with solar or may not be familiar with solar? Lot of questions there, so feel free to dive into where you see fit.
Sure. Yeah. Well, Nexamp generally tries to build that trust through transparency as much as we can. We have in-house developers as well as acquiring from other developers. So our developers might be the first ones on the ground in a given municipality or county. But even if it's if it's a first time experience for that particular jurisdiction, or it's they're pretty used to solar projects, the approach is kind of similar. What we want is that the developers that we have in the field are experts in understanding the programs and regulations that are governing the projects that are being proposed. And also are endeavoring to understand the motivations and the sensitivities of community leaders and community residents in that area. So if we're not receptive to those concerns or coming across as eager to share and educate about what we want to do, we're not doing our job. We really want to, we believe that each project, and we want to express and share why each project is going to be a community good. And so that foundation of trust is what we're trying to build through that. Conversations are really the heart of it all. So we try to engage in those informational conversations with community officials, and whether it be a neighborhood session before a permit hearing, things like that are all good ways to sort of grow that trust, build that education level. So I think that informational meeting style is kind of especially important in those communities you mentioned where totally new to solar. We were seeing a lot of that in, for example, New York 3 or 4 years ago, Illinois 2 years ago now, and just this last year in Maine. Those are where, states where community solar policies were enacted, and you saw sort of a rapid growth in companies like Nexamp in those markets putting proposals out there. So I think you may also see that in those sort of new markets, as we call them, that jurisdictions might be even crafting their very first solar ordinance or zoning regulation. So kind of trying to get involved early in a way that's collaborative, puts the best face of the industry forward. You can have, some reasonable influence in that process that's that lands on a ordinance or a regulation that makes sense for everyone, rather than one that's overly restrictive or so loose that they're going to end up with problems. So we've tried to do that. I think ultimately the message that we want to try to drive home is that our community solar product can benefit residents and businesses in the community. And we speak particularly kind of to how we have a community solar subscription offering where residents and businesses can become subscribers or off-takers of the energy we're producing in the project that's going to sit in their town or county. So that's compelling. I can get into a little bit more on that later, but that's kind of the way we approach any market, particularly newer markets.
Yeah, that's great, and I think this is going to be a good one for Michael to chime in on too. I know you mentioned, Ethan, that you guys tend to follow the legislation and the community scale programs, and so there's a group of folks going in, and it's a much smaller footprint, and so those conversations with local municipalities and public may be a little bit different, whereas Michael and Vinergy's scale of utility scale developments is much larger. So I'm curious as to your insight on navigating communities when you guys have such a larger footprint, and I imagine similar but different conversations.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I agree. There's probably a lot more similar than there is different, but you're right. The sheer scale, has the potential to sound a lot scarier to folks. But first and foremost, I think what we and our teams try and convey to stakeholders is that we're not going to be able to have one conversation or even two conversations or even three conversations and help you understand the universe of everything that it's going to take to bring a project forward, and to help manage helpful information from misinformation, and making sure that folks are getting the accurate picture of what the project is contemplated to be versus what it is not contemplated to be. Many folks conflate technologies, and don't realize that solar thermal very different than solar photovoltaic versus concentrated solar. These are all different things, but reasonable things for folks to not be familiar with. It continues to not it never ceases to amaze me how little the average person in America understands the energy industry or what it takes for the lights to turn on and off. So part of our trust building is more about us trying to be as transparent as possible, trying to be clear about what we don't know about the site, because oftentimes when we're starting those conversations, there are a lot more unknowns than there are knowns. All we know is that there are some fundamentals at this particular site that are interesting to us. And of course, we need to find landowners that are interested in participating. We need to make sure that there is a regulatory regime that we can actually permit our projects. But one of the long poles in the tent is our interconnection study process that plays out over the course of, in many cases, years. So it's a little bit of a balance between getting folks either too excited that a project is coming before we have a lot of confidence that project is even going to be possible or viable. And so just again having that open line of communication and be willing to talk to folks about the industry as a whole, and what the project is or isn't. There's a lot of different, very, very well-intentioned, questions that have complicated answers, right? Why don't you just build this in a desert, right? There's a lot of transmission related questions and market structure related questions, that it takes for us to answer that. Is your project going to produce EMF? again, another thing that is not going to be an easy, one sentence, two sentence answer. We need to talk about how every piece of electronics and the computers that you're working on right now are producing EMF. The real question is the order of magnitude, right, of EMF that's being produced. So, really trying to have that open line of communication. And then just to piggyback off of one of Ethan's comments, yeah, a lot of times, local jurisdictions might put forth what they believe to be a sound ordinance or policy for land use with respect to solar. And they may think that what they're doing is putting something together that will help enable a project to come in. But what they might not realize is that actually some of the conditions or some of the concepts that they've put together will actually prevent, not create, and not enable us to do so. So just being able to then have that open dialogue that we think what you were trying to get at was this concern, okay? And we think we could get there, by doing this instead of that, and then trying to work with them and show them, look, these are some other communities that we worked with, and this is how they handled that same issue. You don't have to take my word for it, but maybe we can put you in contact with some of those folks. With respect to the being first to market or not, I think different folks have different perspectives on that. My own is that when you're going into a market that maybe doesn't have familiarity with solar, that is an opportunity to help us facilitate a conversation where maybe folks aren't already coming into it with firm positions that are either accurate or inaccurate. When we come in, oh, sorry, go on.
I was going to say along the lines, we actually got a question that aligns right with that. So when you are educating those communities, what are some tools that you've used or witnessed to help the communities understand energy and solar and its benefits? I know that in attending a lot of these public hearings, that's something that's very critical to getting the community to buy off on, is making sure they understand what exactly solar is and the energy like you mentioned, but then also the benefits it can provide to not only the environment, but the community. What are some tools that you guys have used or seen used that have been successful?
Yeah, I think maybe the number one item would be economic impact studies that we'll put together through third parties that would help identify. There's multiple different economic creative streams. One of which would be the direct folks to whom we're paying for the construction of the facility. The other of which would be the direct payments we're making to landowners for hosting the facilities. The other would be the taxes from sales taxes and property taxes that the projects are spinning off over time. But then the O&M and operations and maintenance folks that are going to make that community their own home and have their families going to school there. So we often will put together reports to illustrate the direct job impacts, the indirect, and then what's referred to as induced job creation that any one of these projects can create.
Yeah, that's great. And then Ethan, you mentioned something I just had a question on. So town hall meetings and neighborhood meetings and things like that. What is your guys' typical approach? Is that an every project requirement? Do you tend to do it by market? And then how have you guys pivoted with the virtual environment? Have you been hosting any virtual town halls or seen any success in that?
Yeah, so we'll try to kind of get proactive with a community meeting that we'll actually host if we see a project that looks like it's particularly in an area with a lot of residential abutters, for example. You kind of just site-specific decision-making process. There are times when it's an established process. We'll talk to folks at our hearing. They're going to get a notice in the mail if they're within a certain distance of the proposal. So we'll see them there. But yeah, sometimes we'll proactively get out there and try to have those conversations. So yeah, I mean, it can be, sometimes those conversations are challenging and you wish you didn't get out there and be proactive. I think the goal of them is that, if people are they're going to show up if they're concerned about a project with questions. If they're showing up for the very first time in that public hearing, you're going to spend a lot of time answering questions that you might have been able to kind of get that information out there in a less formal way and a more conversational way, which is the way we prefer to do it in that more proactive setting.
Awesome. One other question that came up here, and I think this will be the last one, and then we'll go to our next question, is just in general, we see this a lot with the aesthetics, and I bought this farmland and like looking over the agricultural fields and things like that, those type of questions. What tools and resources have you guys used to either alleviate the aesthetics question or be able to provide some sort of means for those folks that get them to be in support of the project, or at least navigate through that process during the public hearing?
Who do you want to go first, Jason?
It's up to you. I guess, Michael, let's start with you.
Yeah, happy to do so. Number one, to the extent there aren't county requirements or state requirements for there to be vegetative buffers and screens around projects, either to obstruct or conceal from residences or public rights of way, we are more than happy to incorporate the same through our stakeholder engagement process. And so, what we try and do, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Some folks don't seem to mind whether there's crops in the field that are using sunlight to convert, through photosynthesis and creating crops out in the field as compared to electrons. Other folks take exception to that. And so in either case, we work with firms actually quite similar to, and actually in many cases, Kimley Horn, to produce renderings, right? Where what we can do is try and come up with a vegetative screen mix that will do a good job of both surviving in the particular climate that we're looking at and providing sufficient screening to, again, obscure at worst and conceal at best the perceived adverse impact on viewshed.
Yeah, I think I can speak to experience in that, and the goal of just the solar industry is to be a low impact development, right, and be a neighbor that's not noticed. And so those screening and those visual renderings, I think, and working with the local communities and the residents is a critical part to our development, right? I mean, there's the people that do have to live next to these solar farms, and like you said, there's a lot of different interpretations of that, and being able to work with those local residences to come to an agreeable outcome, I think is definitely something that is part of the navigating through the process. So in the interest of time, I think we'll move on from this one to our next question. This one has to do with the mentality on de-risking. So we know that part of the developer's process and cycle is getting the land under control and then starting your de-risking process and figuring out if it's viable, and that can take a variety of shapes and forms depending on the developer and the company's process. So Ethan, I'll start this with you. When Nexamp starts de-risking projects and are going through your environmental and everything like that, do you have a list of these are must-haves and these are project specific? If you could navigate through your guys' process, I think that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of jump back to the last question very briefly, I think the aesthetic question is one that comes up often, particularly in more developed parts of the country. It's one where 9 times out of 10 we can reach a solution that's some kind of screening for a project, whether it's existing vegetation, plantings that are workable for everyone, including the project economics. But we do get those cases where the municipality or the county is particularly concerned and really is wanting the project to be completely invisible, and achieving that is just not the economics of the project can't bear it. So we do run into that from time to time, and I think as a society, as a country, as we're trying to expand renewables, we all need to kind of think a little bit about checking our NIMBYism a little and thinking we may have to see a solar panel, we may have to see a wind turbine, it might be kind of near our house because we have a climate crisis going on. So I think, like I said, 9 times out of 10, that's not the conversation. It's reasonable. Yeah, we can do some screening and try to shield this thing. But that is kind of how I feel about it for the extreme cases where someone's trying to get you to have a project be completely invisible. But as far as de-risking, it's a great question. On any project, we have sort of our must-haves. So, you've got your site control, your permits, your design and production numbers. You need your interconnection certainty, and you need your revenue and incentive certainty. And you're plugging that all into a pricing or economic model for the project to see if it pencils. So you want to have as much certainty on those items as you can. The form of that is different in different markets. The permitting regimes are different. The interconnection agreements are structured a little differently, but those are kind of universal items across all of our different states that we operate in. Another one that is typical for developers to need certainty on is your off-takers or your subscribers are lined up, or you have line of sight on them being lined up to actually take the energy you're producing. At Nexamp, we kind of, as developers, whether we're acquiring or developing ourselves, we have really high confidence in our energy sales and community solar team to get that offtake and subscription done for us. So that's never really in doubt for us, thankfully. It's the other pieces and consultants who are on the ground in a given market, like Kimley Horn, that we can tap for that depth of expertise on permitting and design matters are really invaluable as part of that. And you'd say one of the things that does vary quite a bit from project to project actually ends up being one of the drier things. If you're an engineer or developer, you don't expect it, but that's title work. We see a lot of projects where we're going to require an Alta survey and a title commitment before we get a project financed. And if we're acquiring it or doing it ourselves, we need to have those in hand. We need to work with a real estate counsel to resolve title exceptions. If we're acquiring, we're working with the seller to get that done. And those title issues can be easy, straightforward. It can take a matter of days to get them hammered out, or just depending on the property and what its history is like, you can have thorny issues in there, like historic easements or encroachments that are not geographically well defined. The land can be burdened with some kind of debt or lien that is ancient that you need to go running down. So it can take weeks or months to get that figured out. So that's one thing we're trying to get after earlier and earlier in the process is to kind of get that title cleaned up as early as we can, because that can be an X factor for sure.
Yeah, that's great. And then Michael, to kick it to you, in regards to a lot of the environmental studies, I know that we've helped with along those lines. Feel free to chime in on things that Ethan hit too, but what about phase 1 ESAs, wetland delineation, cultural resource, threatened and endangered species? How do you guys approach that as a developer on your projects?
Yeah, great question. So the short story is, we can't even go out and start performing field studies on projects until we have signed up the real property agreements. So, for the most part, we're quite limited when we start signing up land and what we know. We've got some satellite imagery and some publicly available information. Then we hire some folks like yourself to go out and to do those wetland delineations. We might get topography, collect topography data for the site, as well as a preliminary geotechnical analysis. The combination of those are probably going to turn what looked like a much, much larger piece of land that you would think, oh my God, there's 2,000 acres here, that could be built. And when you start layering in just the items before we even start talking about setbacks and so on, a much, much smaller footprint of a likely to be buildable area. So, one thing that, we do and also goes back to the, misinformation and the importance of keeping a close line of communication with folks. A lot of times there might all of a sudden be this perception that, oh my God, I've heard that they've signed up X thousand acres of land. Now they're going to build a project that occupies that. right? Which is a very, very different number than the, call it a 7 acres per megawatt or so that might be actual once we've completed all of our diligence. So what we try and do is cast a wide net to make sure that the dollars that we're spending, the effort that we're taking, the excitement we're creating in the community, maybe our project is going to have to be a little bit smaller than we expected. Maybe it turns out to be a little bit more expensive than we expected, but it's still going to remain a viable project after we've done some of those field studies. We've identified, as you suggested, the phase 1 ESA. Are there any RECs, recognized environmental contaminants on the site? That if we can identify early, it is so much easier and cheaper for us to, avoid those things on the front end, and potentially then now all of a sudden we're potentially avoiding a different issue where maybe that gentleman that Ethan was saying, wanted the plant to be invisible. Maybe it's going to be invisible because of the result of some of our field studies that determine that portion of the property isn't even going to be buildable. So that's a little bit of our perspective, that we try and cast a wide net and then just keep combing through the detail to come up with the optimal site to be built that can be permitted as well.
Yeah, and I can build on some of that, Jason. I think all those important things you talked about, Michael, the constraints that get layered on, you just having a consultant that really has a pulse on the local nuances and what's required at multiple local levels, state levels, because a miss there can be critical, and a project that looks good, when you layer on another constraint, you certainly want to be able to look around the corner there. And I think talking about de-risking some, one thing we're doing that I think is great is we really try to granulate effort. Just because we get an RFP or a scope of work and it's asking for something, I mean, we do try to ask the right questions. And so if that's on hydrology, maybe you don't need the Cadillac yet. Let's granulate the effort from desktop to a first model run, and then we can do the bells and whistles later. Same thing for grading, Jason. I know we're doing a lot of innovative stuff in this space, but we're able to do some high level earthwork estimates, and we can always go detailed. We know the layouts are going to change when the EPC comes on board, likely, and there's this process that we need to go through. So same for environmental and other techniques we're using to just ease into it, match the effort and the spend with the risk that's at hand, and just try to check the box on what you need in really the most effective way.
Yeah, great. I mean, so if I'm hearing that all correctly, Michael, you guys do go through with all of those. It's just a matter of the timing through the development cycle. By the time that you guys are in full design, you've tackled all of those environmental items. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, that is safe to say. The only, just to put a finer point on it, is John had kind of mentioned that the only question becomes the degree of precision, that we might be, advancing at a particular time. Again, a preliminary geotech is a different scope than preliminary plus pilot testing versus final geotech. And again, we're trying to just lockstep move forward, make sure we're first flushing out fatal flaws. And then from that point forward, now we're talking about optimization, and tweaking what actually would be the least impactful and most economic project.
Great. Awesome. Well, then to put a bow on that one and flip to the next question, we're going to pivot a little bit here on the context with this question. So this is more specific to Invenergy and Nexamp as companies and teams. And we'll start with you, Ethan, I guess, what makes you guys unique in the market? We know there's just a ton of demand for solar right now, and a lot of different developers and a lot of different companies and a lot of different approaches. What is Nexamp's niche in the market, and what is your guys' separator?
Sure. Yeah. So I think Nexamp is a great place to be, a good place to deploy solar and work with other developers, because we're vertically integrated between development, construction, EPC services are in-house. Our O&M team, energy monitoring center, all in-house, and our energy sales and community solar subscription teams are in-house as well. So I think we bring some experience to bear there, and some internal efficiencies where a lot of companies are structured to different pieces of that life cycle of a project are either subbed out entirely, or they're actually selling the project off to an EPC, a builder operator, or building it and then selling it to an operator for long-term ownership. Nexamp is kind of our business model is to do A to Z. It's an advantage to be able to go into a community and say, we want to be your community partner here for 20, 30 years, the life cycle of the project, or longer. So that is nice to be able to say. I think as a practical matter, when we have, for example, an acquisition that we're doing due diligence on, working with a seller partner, we're able to go get answers pretty quickly internally. We think that we're able to have some efficiencies. We're able to get groups of professionals together who are, whether it be a solar design engineer, civil engineers like our colleagues, our consultants at Kimley Horn, with construction directors from Nexamp, O&M managers from Nexamp, and really roll up our sleeves and get after what a workable solution might be. So I think we end up at a fairly accurate estimating model that way. We're not relying as much on outside quotations or bids as some other organizational structures might be. And really, it's just a nice, I think, place for professionals to be in that you get to see the full spectrum, within the company. So everyone in different parts of the company helps each other, raise our collective IQ on how a solar project works from soup to nuts. So I'd say that's an advantage for us for a variety of different reasons. And, personally, just a good place to work, good environment to work in.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks. Michael, what about you, Invenergy?
Yeah, so Invenergy is also vertically integrated in a number of ways, except for the EPC component. We do quite a bit of our own the procurement of major equipment, but do rely on third-party contractors for the majority of the E&C in the EPC. So we greenfield projects. We'll take them through development. We will engineer them to a certain point, and then we will arrange financing for those projects. We'll use our own equity, cash equity, and tax equity where appropriate. We'll solicit third-party, financing partners where it makes sense for us to do that. And then we've got an operations and maintenance team that are all in-house. They're all employees of Invenergy. And in fact, we've started to now operate many other third-party operations and maintenance division of our organization. So yeah, that life cycle, right? Learning some lessons with every project, we'll have our meetings and talk through, what we learned from that last transaction, or that last project that we're going to be able to apply to the next. And that feedback loop has definitely been helpful. But we're a private organization, and our senior leadership team has been effectively together for almost 30 years. That team has been working together, so predating the time at Invenergy. So these are some folks that have seen a lot of booms, a lot of busts, in the energy industry, and have been able to manage those. We're a quite flat organization, and are able to be quite nimble, changing based on market conditions and demands. So I think the thing that I might describe as what makes Invenergy special is that we don't have a preconceived notion of what the project must be or what the contract structure must be. We can accommodate those of our stakeholders, whether they be landowners on the PPA front or offtake front or build transfer front when we're building projects for utility customers and then turnkey to them. We're agnostic on contract or on structure, so long as there's a project to be had that can add value. The last thing I would just add is that, our company's got somewhere over 1,100 folks now, and the overwhelming majority of them, over 70%, are living and working in the communities that we're building our plants. They're not like me that works in our corporate headquarters. They actually live in these communities. And, I think that's, one component that really seems to resonate with folks, that we're not just trying to, build a project and flip it to somebody.
Yeah. So we do have one question here, which I think is applicable here on project size, more so to Invenergy, but I'll tailor it to you, Ethan, as well. So I guess, Michael, what's the largest project that Invenergy has built to date and that you have in the pipeline, and any highlights to it?
Yeah, so the largest project that we're under construction right now would be our Samson Energy Center in Texas, which is presently, we closed financing on that recently, and will be the largest single phase project in America, 1,300 megawatts across 7 off-takers there. And then we have the next largest, I think, would be our Traverse. It's either Traverse or Maverick, one of those two. It's a 999 megawatt facility in Oklahoma with an 80-mile T line that we're building there.
Nice. And what are the acreages of those? The Texas one, I would imagine in the 7,000 to 10,000 acre range.
Yeah, whatever 7 times.
I
could follow up on that one. I don't work in Texas anymore.
Yep. And then Ethan, to you, I guess the question would be, knowing that you guys are mainly focused at community scale, where's the bulk of your portfolios? How do you guys typically approach that from a number of project size?
From a number of project size, you mean the size of the project or the number of projects?
The portfolios. I guess that was poorly worded. So the bulk of your portfolios, where are those located, and how many projects have you guys completed?
Yeah, so I think we're in obviously a different stratosphere of project size than Invenergy. So I think most of our projects are going to be in the 1 to 7 megawatt DC range, and that's just where the sweet spot of community solar size programs around the country have evolved. So that, we're talking on the order of 10, 15, 20, 30 acre size projects connecting to distribution level infrastructure rather than transmission level infrastructure. So a bit of a different animal. Our project base to date is heavily Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, as far as built and operating projects. Though you'll start to see, as our projects complete construction in Illinois from a cycle last year and the year before of development, I think Illinois is going to join that sort of operating base of projects. I think we're at the point where we're exceeding the 300 megawatt mark in total operating projects. So divide that out by an average of something like 3, 4, 5 megawatts, and you'll get something like the number of total operating assets. So that's kind of the realm we're dealing with. Beginning to explore, like I said earlier, standalone storage opportunities, some sweet spot utility scale opportunities. That's in the pipeline, but not quite there yet. So stay tuned. But community solar DG scale stuff will continue to be our bread and butter. And I think we're eager to see new markets come online and favorable policy. We're basically set up to go into any state that is enacting favorable policy. We'll see you there if you're working in this field. So.
Yeah, and you just sparked a follow-up question to me there. What is Nexamp's process on following those policies? Do you have in-house council that are tracking those? How do you guys stay on top of the policies in states and all the legislation?
Yeah, good question. So our channel development team that I work with and our business development team that handles our in-house development work very closely with a small policy team that we do have in-house. So those are regulatory and policy professionals. A couple of them do have legal backgrounds, but they're very focused on tracking policy at various state houses around the country and federally. So we have sort of open comms with that group. We're talking all the time to hear what the latest is in different states around the country. So there's a handful of states that there always seems to be something brewing, and Maine is a recent example where for years there was talk of good solar policy, and a change of administration really unlocked that being passed out of the legislature. So that's kind of a common situation where state governments have to some degree realized, look, there's models for this around the country. We can have residents and businesses saving money. We can reduce our carbon emissions, and we can do so in a way that's encouraging development and encouraging private investment in a way that's not shelling out a lot of state funds. And so I think you'll start to see more of that. It's sort of something that kind of ties into speaking earlier about, which is, how do you educate people? Why do you make the case for solar? Why solar? Something that kind of crosses across the political spectrum is, local, independently produced energy that saves people money. You don't have to be an environmentalist to see the benefit in that. Resiliency is important. People don't want blackouts. People want something that's there in their community. I think it's a win-win, and more states are starting to realize that.
Great. John, I see you looking like you're pretty bored over there. I think we just got a good question come through for you here. Emphasis, and how much emphasis do you put on erosion, sediment control, and revegetation on a site? So try to keep it to 1 or 2 minutes. I know you could talk to this about this for days, but if you want to talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, complicated, but I think a big emphasis, it's in really an EPC is who is working to get those things established and maintaining erosion control on site. So especially with the revegetation, that is definitely in all of our best interests to be proactive on that. And I think there's a balance between doing preventative type work versus kind of being reactionary. And so there's a sweet spot, I think, in the middle. And when you come on a site, I think understanding it's going to be different from everyone. I think even in, say, coastal North Carolina, where things are really flat, you're not dealing with as erodible velocities, but the water takes a while to get off site. It can be really wet working conditions, and compare that to maybe Western North Carolina, where slopes can be, very extreme, and it's absolutely in your best interest to stabilize. And so I think we work to understand all the state regulations and do great erosion control design, and kind of think about all our past projects and where we've seen success, and do a lot of sharing of knowledge internally. I think our teams page is, bar none, the amount of knowledge and cross information that we're able to share and collaborate on. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, John. All right, so this will be the last question. So we'll start with you, Michael, on this one. And it's a little open-ended, but I think let's focus on the first in the future of this one. So what are the challenges that you face now and in the future, if you've got a crystal ball?
Well, I don't need a crystal ball to know that, again, just information management and management of misinformation are going to continue to be challenges for us moving forward, and are going to force us to remain as disciplined as possible to make sure that we're getting out the information, we're making ourselves as available as possible about what we do know at a given point in time versus what we don't know at a given point in time. And and being patient, patient with folks as they as we work with them to educate them about some of the nuances about why we don't know some of that information at this time. I think a part of that, I think, is also dealing with the perception that, oh my God, now all of a sudden all these solar projects are happening. There's not going to be any farmland left by the time that all of these projects happen, and helping folks understand just because a project got a permit does not mean that it is moving forward. There are transmission constraints that are going to preclude many of these projects from being able to come online. I think the last part, I think Ethan had mentioned this earlier, but just focusing on the reality that we are facing climate change. We need to change our energy mix. We're not purporting that solar is the end all be all answer for it. It is one component that helps move us towards a more carbon-free environment than in the future than we've had in the past. Those are some of the biggest challenges I foresee us continuing to deal with moving forward.
All right, Ethan, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, absolutely, Jason. Could you do me a favor and remind me of the question, because I was just in the
Q&A.
I was in the Q&A.
Biggest challenges you foresee now and in the future.
All right, cool. Yeah, just answered, I think, Ray's question in the Q&A there. So yeah, the biggest challenges, I think, are interconnection related for community scale solar, particularly in mature markets for solar. Development activity long ago outpaced really any reasonable level of grid planning or readiness. So as a result, because of a lack of long-term planning and coordination between utility companies and the regional ISOs, you're seeing cluster studies, transmission impacts, that's become pervasive, particularly in the Northeast. Developers are getting saddled with the costs of that, lack of schedule certainty, multi-year timelines, and projects at this scale with the smaller economics. We can't usually bear that kind of waiting around time. So that threatens to kind of bring the industry to a halt in some of these more mature states. So I think that's an ongoing evolving issue, utility company by utility company, ISO by ISO, particularly though we're dealing with it with ISO New England right now. I'd say number two is probably compensation structures. In a regulated environment, we're basically entirely dependent on having those mechanisms in place that allow us to predict how we're going to monetize the generation at a reasonable return.
Yep.
So we're not in the business of wholesale pricing like a utility scale project may be. We're dealing with community scale incentive revenue programs. So those program rules change and expanding capacity in those programs. They typically have a cap, and then there's an expansion of whatever state program there is, and you may be waiting around for that expansion to occur. You're trying to, get a crystal ball out with your policy folks to predict when it'll occur and what the revenue structures will be. So that we're left guessing about the future viability of a project. I'd say overall compensation levels have dropped across all our markets on average. And that's somewhat by design. The intent philosophically was that community scale solar incentives were in place to kind of bend the cost curve. And as the industry grew, prices on equipment and so forth would fall. And that's been true. Equipment prices have fallen, particularly panel prices on a per kilowatt of production basis. But you see things like interconnection costs rising and rising as a utility company is taking more and more solar onto its grid. The solar companies, the developers are paying for those interconnection upgrade costs. So that's really good for the grid as a whole because you have that investment in more robust infrastructure, but it's being borne by these individual projects. So you need, if you have a falling revenue structure on the incentive program at the state level, but you have rising interconnection costs. Philosophically, that's not the runway that was really intended when the programs were designed. So that's an ongoing sort of developer plus policy realm, political realm conversation that's going on in real time now in different markets.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. In interest of time, we're going to wrap it up here. If we did not get to your question, we're going to be logging those, and we'll do our best to follow up with everybody's question. As I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be sending out the video recording for this webinar. And in addition with that, we'll have the contact info for all three panelists and myself. I'd like to close by thanking each of our panelists, John, Ethan, Michael. Really appreciate your time. Thanks again. And thanks to all the attendees who participated. And if you're watching this video after the live video is done, thanks for taking that time to watch us. And hopefully we'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, folks.